One of the most common chess opening variations, especially in online blitz games, begins with white playing the Italian game. Pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. After white develops the bishop to c4, you respond with knight to f6, and quite often, white will immediately jump in with knight to g5, aiming to launch the quick and dangerous fried liver attack. This line is frequently successful because many players as black don't know the correct way to respond. But here's how you can take control. After knight to g5, you play pawn to d5, challenging the center. When white captures with pawn takes d5, most players instinctively play knight to a5, which is the main line. However, many inexperienced players instead recapture on d5 immediately, which is incorrect and usually leads to a worse position for black. But what I'm going to suggest to you here is a paradoxical idea. Instead of recapturing on d5 or playing knight to a5, you shock your opponent by playing pawn to b5. Yes, that's right. You push a side pawn, completely ignoring the tension in the center. This unexpected move usually throws your opponent off. Most of them will assume it's just a blunder and instinctively capture the pawn with bishop takes b5. But in reality, this move sets a trap, and capturing it is actually a serious mistake. Now you play queen takes d5, and suddenly you're attacking both the bishop and the pawn on g2, which also threatens the rook on h1. White, under pressure, usually responds with bishop takes c6, hoping to eliminate one of the threats. After queen takes c6, you're still targeting the pawn on g2, and if white now castles kingside, you respond with bishop to b7. This move sacrifices a pawn temporarily, but in fact, it helps set up a powerful diagonal battery along a8 to h1. You are now threatening queen takes g2 checkmate, and although white can delay this threat, they can't stop it effectively. Let's look at some common defensive tries by white. The most frequent is pawn to f3, trying to block the diagonal. At this point, you play pawn to h6, attacking the knight on g5 and gaining time. This knight on g5, although it looks aggressive, doesn't contribute much and just gives you extra tempi for your attack. In most cases, you'll castle queenside, activating your rook on the d-file, and bring your bishop to c5, where it joins the attack forcefully. After h6, white must retreat the knight. And now comes one of the most ruthless attacking moves in the position, pawn to g5. With this, you are going for a direct breakthrough. Your goal is to play pawn to g4, open the g-file, and finish with queen takes g2 checkmate. White often responds with knight to f2, trying to guard against g4, but you push forward with pawn to g4 anyway.
500 subscribers.
If white captures this pawn, it usually leads to disaster. So instead, they try to ignore it, playing something like knight to c3 or pawn to d3. But it doesn't matter. You continue with pawn takes on f3, and now white will try to trade queens to neutralize your attack. But here's the catch. After queen takes f3 and queen takes f3, you bring the rook to g8, and the attack continues full force. White's position collapses, and checkmate is often just a few moves away. This variation turns the aggressive fried liver setup completely against white, and most players will fall into your trap simply because they've never seen anything like it. Anyway, at this point, white is already in deep trouble. No matter how they try to cover their weaknesses, you still have powerful attacking options. Let's say white tries to retreat or reposition. For example, knight to g4 is not even possible, because you can simply play pawn to h5 and then capture the knight, leaving white helpless. If white tries king to h1, thinking they're safe, they walk straight into bishop takes f3, and that's checkmate. So, as you can see, even in an endgame-like position, your attack continues to dominate. Now let's look at a slightly different defensive try by white. Instead of playing pawn to f3, which failed earlier, some of your opponents will try knight to f3, aiming to cover the g2 square and neutralize your checkmating threat. Here, it might be tempting to play pawn to e4, trying to kick away the knight, and that's actually a reasonable idea, but I prefer a more precise strategic approach. Rather than closing the diagonal with pawn to e4, keep the long diagonal open. You still have a powerful threat of queen to g2 checkmate looming. So instead, simply castle kingside. This is not only a safe move, but also a strong one, because it activates your rook and places it on a semi-open g-file, where it will soon join the attack. If white now plays a quiet move like pawn to d3, you immediately continue with your aggressive plan, pawn to g5. The goal remains the same, g4 eliminate the knight, and deliver queen takes g2 checkmate. The knight on f3 is absolutely critical for white. If they move it, boom, you go queen takes g2, game over. What if they try to stop you by playing bishop takes g5? That's a massive blunder, because now the g-file is wide open, and you immediately play rook to g8. Now your queen, bishop, and rook are all targeting the same weak spot near the white king. The coordination is deadly, and white is practically defenseless. Let's say white continues playing passive or inaccurate moves. You can capture on g5 with the rook if possible. If the knight ever moves, queen takes g2 ends the game. If white tries to counterattack or block the diagonal, for instance, by playing bishop to f6, you simply reply with queen takes f6. You're still threatening heavily, and now the rook pins the pawn on g2 to the king. If white tries to defend by placing knight to d2 in front of the attack, you can either remove the defender or play ideas like bishop to h6, followed by bishop takes f3. In every case, white's position starts to crumble. Now, in some games from the database, I notice that white tries knight to e4, hoping to block the long diagonal. But that doesn't really help. Why? Because after bishop to e4, they can't recapture, thanks to a devastating pin. The pawn on d3 is pinned to the queen, and white is stuck. In one game, for instance, white played king to h1, hoping to escape threats. Black continued with bishop to b7, then white played queen to e2. Let's make this position today's puzzle, black to play, and find the most efficient winning move in this position. There are several winning options, but can you find the cleanest one? Write your answer down in the comments below, and let's see who gets it right. Now let's return to the most critical position in this entire variation, one that you're going to see very often in your own games. To stop your devastating threat of queen takes g2 checkmate, some opponents may try a less common but more resourceful move, queen to f3. This move feels awkward for white because it places the queen directly in front of their own bishop, which can be uncomfortable positionally. But the truth is, it's actually a pretty good defensive idea for white. Now normally, you don't want to block your own bishop by pushing pawn to e4, since it would close the long diagonal that you're attacking along. But in this particular case, I recommend that you go ahead and play pawn to e4 anyway. Why? Because you do not want to allow a queen exchange. Trading queens would reduce your attacking momentum. So, pawn to e4 is an excellent move here. It gains tempo by attacking the queen, keeping the pressure high. If white responds with queen to e3, just continue with your standard plan. Pawn to h6, kicking away the knight on g5. The knight will usually fall back to h3, a very poor square, completely sidelined. Now, you follow through with castling queenside as always. This gets your rook on the d-file, ready to join the attack, and tucks your king safely away from danger. Take a look at the position now. Your pieces are all active and centralized. White's pieces, on the other hand, are completely passive. That knight on h3 is doing absolutely nothing useful. At this point, even if white captures your pawn on e4, you're not concerned at all, because you were planning to play bishop to c5 anyway. This move hits the queen, and queen to a5 is practically the only retreat square left. Now comes your breakthrough, pawn to e3. This opens the diagonal again and rips through white's position. They are now completely helpless.
Subscribe
For
and
example,
share.
if white tries pawn to f3, trying to keep things closed, you finish the game in style. You play pawn takes d2, which is a discovered check from your bishop to the king. If white plays knight to f2, trying to cover, you could capture the bishop on e3, but you don't need to. There's an even more brilliant finish. Play pawn to d1 and promote it into a new queen. And here's the key detail. The knight on f2 is pinned by your rook, so it cannot capture the promoted queen. If white does take the new queen with the rook, then your own rook recaptures on d1, and that is checkmate. A beautiful and forceful conclusion to this dynamic attacking variation.